Silence can be a weapon disguised as peace. It appears gentle, composed, even noble, yet beneath it, something ancient begins to starve. In her silence, he first saw grace, then distance, then danger. What he called calm was not serenity, but withdrawal, the quiet erosion of his power to define her world. And what he feared most was not her absence, but the mirror it forced him to face. When she stopped explaining herself, his mind grew louder. Each unanswered message became a wound, each pause a verdict. He told himself she was cold, unfeeling, perhaps manipulative. But beneath that defense lived a quieter truth. Her silence had touched the part of him still begging to be seen by the mother who once turned away. Silence, for the unhealed masculine, is not empty. It is rejection in disguise. It awakens the child that still believes love must be earned through control. He called her distant, but she was only done performing. Her words had long been consumed by his interpretations, each sentence translated into proof of either loyalty or betrayal. In retreating, she removed his language of dominance. What remained was the raw echo of his dependency, the sound of his identity collapsing without an audience. The feminine silence holds an archetypal charge. In myth, it is the void before creation, the lunar descent into knowing. Yet to the uninitiated man, that same silence feels like annihilation. He mistakes her inner turning for disappearance, her boundary for punishment. The ego cannot conceive of love that does not orbit its need for reassurance. He begins to spiral, to project. He calls her silence manipulative, cold, even cruel, not realizing he is describing his own relationship to vulnerability. What he names as her cruelty is the reflection of his own repression. What he labels as emotional abandonment is his inability to sit within uncertainty without collapsing into blame. You have seen this pattern. When someone cannot reach you, they begin to imagine your motives. They animate your absence with ghosts of their own making. They do not meet you, they meet their memory of being left. You are no longer a person but a screen for unfinished grief. Projection is the ego's attempt to outsource pain. It paints the other in colors that match its unseen wounds. Jung called it the withdrawal of energy from the inner world into the outer image. What he feared in her silence was not her disappearance, but his own, the fading of the self that only existed in her reflection. He began to chase meaning, to dissect tone and timestamp. He replayed conversations like a man seeking confession in data, but silence offers no data. It demands surrender, and surrender is intolerable to an ego built on performance. Every man carries within him an unhealed anima, the inner feminine that he either idealizes or controls. When that energy remains unconscious, he will project it onto the women he meets. She becomes his muse, his mirror, his mother. Her silence shatters that illusion, revealing not her betrayal but his dependency on her attention to sustain his worth. For her, silence was reclamation, the withdrawal of projection, the end of emotional labor. She no longer fed his need to define her. Yet even she did not fully understand the power of what she invoked. The feminine that turns inward reclaims psychic sovereignty, but she also awakens the masculine shadow, the rage of the unacknowledged boy. He oscillated between guilt and blame, between apology and accusation. The more he tried to speak, the more incoherent his words became. Silence stripped him of control, and without control, he mistook her for chaos. But what he called chaos was only the absence of his dominance. Silence is the ultimate amplifier. It reflects without distortion. In its presence, illusions collapse. The man who needs control will interpret it as attack. The man who seeks truth will recognize it as initiation. You cannot hear silence if your mind fears emptiness. You will fill it with stories, with judgment, with echoes of your unmet need. But if you stay long enough, if you endure the void, silence becomes revelation. It shows you the architecture of your attachment, the reflexes of your defense. He began to dream of her again, not as she was, but as she appeared in fragments, a whisper at the edge of perception, a shadow in his chest. The dreams were not about her body, but about the part of himself she once animated. The anima, once projected outward, was returning home. Every man who seeks wholeness must eventually face this silence. It is the crucible where projection dies and integration begins. He must learn to see her not as mirror, but as messenger, the one who reveals his disconnection from his own depths. He will resist, he will rationalize, but no argument survives the truth of absence. In the quiet, his patterns become visible, his need to be needed, his addiction to reaction. What once felt like love reveals itself as dependency dressed in devotion. Silence unmasks everything. It is the voice of the unconscious saying, enough, no more noise, no more stories, listen. He can choose to drown in that stillness or to descend into it. One path leads to repetition, the other to rebirth. But he must understand her silence was never punishment. It was the beginning of his initiation. The first night after she withdrew, he could not sleep. Not because he missed her voice, but because the quiet dismantled his illusions. He had mistaken her presence for stability, her warmth for permission to remain unexamined. Now, without her, the architecture of his defenses cracked open like a house without walls. Every echo inside him grew louder, the critic, the victim, the lover, the child. He replayed their last conversation. Her words were not sharp, not cruel, only final. That calmness disturbed him more than anger ever could. Rage would have given him a role to play, something to fight against. But her silence stripped away the theater of reaction. There was no more stage, no more script, only the unbearable reflection of himself. In psychological terms, he was encountering his shadow. But he didn't know that. He only felt the discomfort of being unseen. Her silence had removed the mirror in which his identity had long admired itself. He did not yet understand that the pain he felt was not the loss of her, it was the collapse of his self-image. The persona that required her attention to exist had been quietly dismantled. You know that moment, when someone's withdrawal exposes the emptiness beneath your certainty. When what you called love begins to reveal itself as control. You tell yourself you want connection, but what you seek is validation. You want to be chosen, not for who you are, but for what your reflection provides. The ego bargains when threatened. He told himself she was confused, emotional, irrational. He told himself she would return once she remembered how much he had given. These were not thoughts of love. They were negotiations of power. The masculine shadow does not seek understanding. It seeks restoration of dominance, the return of predictability. Jung observed that what we resist in the outer world mirrors what we repress within. Her silence became his projection screen. Every fear of abandonment, every trace of shame, every unhealed rejection was thrown upon it. The less she spoke, the more he filled the void with accusations. In this way, silence became dialogue, not between two people, but between his ego and his unconscious. She, meanwhile, had entered a different terrain. Her silence was not calculated, it was instinctual. The feminine psyche withdraws when overwhelmed by emotional noise. Silence, for her, was not revenge, it was regulation. It was the refusal to continue translating her intuition into a language that demanded proof. She had once tried to explain her feelings, but every expression was intercepted by his analysis. He called it reason. She experienced it as erasure. So she stopped explaining, and in that stillness, something ancient returned, the voice of her inner authority. Not loud, not defensive, simply sovereign. He could not see that yet. The masculine conditioned by dominance interprets feminine sovereignty as rejection. It cannot comprehend a love that does not depend on his control. When he looked at her silence, he saw judgment. When she looked at his reaction, she saw fear. Both were correct, yet incomplete. In Jungian terms, they were entangled in mutual projection. She had once projected safety onto him, the hope that he would hold what she could not express. He had projected salvation onto her, the fantasy that she would redeem his emptiness. Each played God in the other's unconscious until silence shattered the illusion. When projections dissolve, so does enchantment. The spell breaks, and what remains is reality. Two imperfect psyches facing their unhealed patterns. The unconscious drives them toward wholeness, but the ego interprets this drive as conflict. Healing feels like betrayal because it threatens the old identity. He began to oscillate between apology and resentment. He wanted her back, but not her silence. He wanted comfort, not confrontation. The irony was cruel. He longed for intimacy, yet feared the depth where intimacy is born. True connection requires transparency, and transparency requires death, the death of illusion. She too was transforming. Her silence was no longer about him. It became a meditation, a clearing. She began to sense the difference between empathy and self-erasure. The pattern that once bound her to his validation now appeared as a chain she had carried willingly. She realized she had mistaken caretaking for love, compliance for connection. Silence, once a reaction, became awareness. It was no longer about withholding words. It was about holding boundaries. What she reclaimed in that stillness was her. Center, the unmediated feminine that listens to intuition without apology. You may call it cruel, this withdrawal, but cruelty is distortion. Silence is precision. It reveals the measure of another's capacity for presence. It asks, can you hold yourself when no one performs love for you? He could not answer that yet. He filled the void with distractions, other voices, temporary conquests. But every noise sounded hollow. Every laugh ended too quickly. The silence followed him like an unclosed wound, not hers, but his own. Every night he returned to the same question. What did her silence mean? But meaning was never hers to give. Meaning was his to uncover. The question itself was the mirror. And in it, he finally saw the outline of his shadow, terrified, pleading, still chasing the echo of a woman who had stopped performing his reflection. In the weeks that followed, something within him began to decay. Not in the body, but in the scaffolding that had held his identity upright. The performance of strength, the illusion of mastery, they began to crumble under the weight of absence. It was not her silence that broke him, but the truth it contained. Without her response, he could no longer hide behind reaction. There was nothing left to provoke, nothing to fix, nothing to conquer, only the raw presence of himself. Silence, when faced honestly, is the great equalizer. It strips the psyche of pretense. It dismantles hierarchy. It demands submission to what is real. He began to see that his anger toward her was not hatred. It was grief. Grief for the woman he had imagined, for the control he believed was love, for the part of him that could not differentiate affection from possession. When the masculine ego loses control, it often calls that loss betrayal. Yet betrayal is only the soul's revolt against falseness. The psyche will not remain imprisoned by illusion forever. Eventually, truth demands entry. Her silence had been that doorway, a wordless threshold between his past and his potential. He tried to fill the void with understanding. He read books, analyzed patterns, spoke of trauma and attachment. But analysis is still armor when used to avoid feeling. Insight without surrender becomes intellectual anesthesia. He spoke of awareness while resisting vulnerability. He sought transcendence without dissent. The unconscious is not fooled by language. It requires embodiment. It waits patiently for the moment when knowledge collapses into surrender. That moment arrived one morning when he caught his reflection and saw the exhaustion in his own eyes. Not from loss, but from pretending he had not been lost long before she left. The woman had not abandoned him. She had simply stopped participating in his self-deception. You know this truth when it arrives. It does not announce itself with clarity, but with collapse. Something inside you stops arguing. You stop defending the wound. You stop narrating the story as if it were still happening. What remains is silence, not hers, but yours. The stillness that comes after the storm of identity. He began to dream again. This time, the dreams were not about her, but about corridors, mirrors, and doors he could not open. Each dream ended with him hearing his own name whispered from the dark. The unconscious had begun to speak in its own language, imagery, sensation, emotion. It was showing him what projection had concealed, the feminine he had long rejected within himself. The anima once sought in women now appeared in symbols, in water, in moonlight, in music that made his chest ache. She was not gone, she had simply withdrawn from form to essence. When a man ceases to chase the feminine outside himself, she returns within not as a lover but as intuition, not as validation but as wisdom. Still, the ego resisted. It whispered, "You are losing yourself." But what was being lost was not the self, only the mask. He began to see that silence had never been her weapon. It had been her mirror. And through it, he faced his own inability to receive the feminine without needing to possess it. The polarity between masculine and feminine is not war, it is alchemy. The masculine seeks order, the feminine moves through chaos. But when either pole fears its counterpart, harmony becomes dominance. He had lived in fear of the feminine chaos, the unpredictability of feeling, the vulnerability of surrender. So he built walls of reason, logic, control. Her silence tore them down not with force but with absence. She had stopped offering him the illusion of safety, and in that absence he learned that safety could not come from control. It could only come from truth, truth without defense, awareness without distortion. He began to understand why her silence had felt like death, because it was. The death of his dependency, his projection, his unconscious belief that love must be earned through dominance. What died in her absence was the man he had been, the one afraid to meet his own heart. In that death, something else began to stir, not a new persona but an emerging presence, the awareness that did not need to be right or powerful or desired, the awareness that could simply witness. This was not strength in the old sense, it was consciousness, the beginning of individuation. He realized he no longer wanted her to return, not because he no longer cared, but because he finally understood that she was never the source of what he sought. She had only mirrored what was missing. Love had not left him. Awareness had arrived. You may think this is the end, but awakening is never dramatic. It is subtle. It does not announce itself as triumph, but as stillness. You wake one morning and notice you are no longer chasing ghosts. The silence that once terrified you now feels like home. In that space, something sacred unfolds, the reconciliation of opposites. The man no longer rejects the feminine, he listens to her. The woman no longer performs for the masculine, she stands beside him. In the psyche, they are one. Her silence had not destroyed him, it had delivered him. There comes a moment when silence stops being absence and becomes awareness itself. The noise of the ego dissolves, and what remains is perception, direct, unfiltered, unargued. He had reached that threshold. The agony that once demanded answers had softened into observation. He could now sit within the ache without reaching for control. The woman who once haunted him no longer held the power to define his state. She had become something else entirely, an archetype, an inner teacher cloaked in memory. Her silence still lingered, but no longer as punishment. It had transformed into atmosphere, the psychic climate through which he now moved. He began to understand what she had represented, the unclaimed feminine within him, the soul's intuitive depth he had long mistaken for weakness. The more he listened to that inner current, the more his old impulses, the need to fix, to argue, to possess, began to feel foreign. This was the beginning of descent. Jung wrote that the process of individuation requires confrontation with the unconscious, a meeting with the shadow and the anima. For the masculine psyche, the anima is both guide and test. She seduces him into the depths, where intellect dissolves into instinct. Only when he stops resisting does her face change from temptress to teacher, from chaos to clarity. He began to recall moments from their past that once filled him with anger. Now they revealed structure. Her withdrawal had not been cruelty, it was the unconscious staging his initiation. He had been too identified with the persona, the rational protector, the provider, the one who must always know. Her silence dismantled that illusion, forcing him to meet what existed beneath the armor, The frightened child, the insecure lover, the lost man who did not know how to feel without control. You have lived this too, in some form, the collapse of certainty that exposes the depth of your dependency. It feels like loss, but it is rebirth. What dies is the part of you that needed validation to exist. What emerges is the capacity to witness love without consuming it. In the absence of her voice, he began to hear his own. Not the external persona that negotiated power, but the quieter tone beneath it, the one that trembled when speaking truth. He realized he had never truly listened to himself, only to his defenses. His internal dialogue had been a courtroom, not a sanctuary. Every feeling cross-examined, every need reduced to logic. Her silence had exiled him from that courtroom. Now, at last, he could feel without justification. He began to dream again of water. Not turbulent oceans, but still lakes, dark and deep. Jung saw water as the symbol of the unconscious, the feminine matrix from which awareness arises. Each dream invited him closer to that stillness. When he submerged, he found fragments of his own reflection floating there. Faces of women he had desired, hurt, idealized. They were not separate people, but echoes of his own disowned nature, tenderness, empathy, vulnerability. To love the feminine, he now understood, was to love what he had denied in himself. Her silence had been a mirror, but also a summons. It asked him to return to his own depths, to reclaim what he had once projected outward as her. The masculine that has not integrated the feminine seeks control. The masculine that has met her seeks truth. Control is reactive, truth is receptive. He began to experience the difference. Where he once argued, he now inquired. Where he once demanded, he now listened. Presence replaced pursuit. Yet this awareness did not come cleanly. The shadow does not yield its dominance without resistance. At times, he still felt the old impulses rise, the desire to send a message, to prove understanding, to win back perception. But now, he caught himself mid-motion. The awareness had become fast. Than the pattern. Each time he paused, the energy that once sought outward validation retracted inward. Integration had begun. And her, she had moved on, perhaps. Or perhaps she too had entered her own descent, meeting the parts of herself that had once equated love with sacrifice. Their stories no longer intersected, yet the field between them remained alive, the archetypal dance of anima and animus, eternally mirroring, eternally evolving. He no longer romanticized her. That was the sign of maturity. Idealization had been replaced by gratitude, not for what she gave, but for what she revealed. The silence that once dismantled him now sustained him. It had become the sound of presence, the rhythm of awareness itself. You begin to see it too, how every loss carries an encoded initiation. How the people who withdraw are not stealing something from you, but returning something to you. The part you outsourced, the truth you abandoned, the wholeness you forgot. He stood at last in that recognition. No speech, no plea, no resolution. Just stillness, a clarity that did not need to be named. He saw that love was not possession, nor fusion, nor performance. Love was awareness, and awareness required silence. He no longer waited for her to speak. He had become what her silence once taught. He woke one morning to a strange calm, not relief, but release. The tension that once lived behind his ribs was gone. The urge to prove, to persuade, to correct had evaporated. Silence had taught him a new rhythm, slow, deliberate, unprovoked. For the first time, he could feel without needing to act. He looked around his life and saw the ruins of old narratives, messages left unsent, apologies rehearsed but never delivered, the faint echo of stories he once told to justify pain. All of it felt distant now, like a past life glimpsed through fog. What had changed was not circumstance, but center. Awareness had migrated from the mind to the soul. In Jungian terms, the man had crossed into the field of the self, the organizing totality that reconciles opposites. The war between ego and shadow was no longer necessary. What once felt like conflict now appeared as dialogue. He began to recognize his inner figures not as enemies but as messengers. The critic revealed his fear of worthlessness. The controller masked his longing for safety. The lover, beneath his intensity, hid a simple wish to be met without disguise. He understood now that silence was the language of the self. It speaks not in words but in presence. When the conscious mind grows quiet, the unconscious rises to meet it, offering images, sensations, intuitions. This is not suppression, it is communication. What he had once called emptiness was fullness without noise. You might think silence means withdrawal, but it is the opposite. It is the psyche's most intimate gesture. When one withdraws from projection, one returns to authenticity. You stop trying to be heard and start listening to what is already speaking through you. He began to see how often relationships collapse not from lack of love, but from lack of awareness. Two unconscious psyches trying to complete each other will eventually collide. Love without individuation becomes possession. Silence becomes manipulation. But when awareness enters, silence transforms from absence to alignment. Her silence had once triggered his fear of abandonment. Now he understood it as the natural expression of boundaries. She had not abandoned him. She had stopped rescuing him from his own unconscious. And in doing so, she had granted him a mirror far more honest than words could ever offer. He wondered whether she knew the role she had played, whether she had sensed the archetype moving through her. Perhaps not. The unconscious uses people as instruments of evolution, often without their awareness. The anima is not merely a woman. She is the living symbol of what the man must reclaim. She appears in many forms: a lover, a teacher, a silence, each time inviting him toward wholeness. When he finally stopped resisting, something remarkable happened. The energy he had spent projecting outward turned inward, transmuting into creativity. He began to write, to sculpt, to walk for hours without purpose. The same longing that once chained him to her attention now flowed into expression. This was sublimation, the psychic transformation of desire into meaning. The anima, once externalized, had become muse. Through this process, he began to perceive a deeper polarity. Masculine and feminine were no longer genders to him. They were movements of consciousness. The masculine sought clarity, direction, form. The feminine held intuition, surrender, depth. Within him, both now spoke in rhythm. The inner marriage had begun. He realized the tragedy of his earlier years, how he had confused love with merging, devotion with disappearance. He had loved her through fear, needing her to reflect what he could not accept. In himself, that was never love. It was survival disguised as intimacy. True love, he saw now, begins only when projection ends. You may resist this truth as he once did. You may think love must be mutual performance, that attention proves value. But awareness dismantles that illusion. Love is not transaction. It is recognition. When two aware beings meet, silence becomes communion, not punishment. He no longer needed her forgiveness. He no longer needed her return. He did not even need her understanding. He saw now that what he had been chasing was not her, but his own disowned wholeness. She had been the door through which he met himself. He began to feel gratitude in the smallest details: the quiet morning light, the stillness before speaking, the breath between thoughts. What had once been emptiness now shimmered with meaning. Silence had not taken love away, it had purified it. He could imagine her somewhere far away, perhaps laughing, perhaps silent still. But she was no longer the ghost of his longing. She was an image integrated into the soul, the eternal feminine, both beyond him and within him. In that awareness, he smiled, not because the story ended happily, but because it ended consciously. The silence that once dismantled him had rebuilt him in truth. He had entered the realm beyond reaction, where love no longer clings, where awareness no longer defends, where silence no longer wounds. He understood now, she had never been his nightmare. She had been his mirror. And when he finally stopped fearing her silence, he could hear what it had been saying all along. There is a quiet that follows revelation, not relief, but recognition. The psyche, having witnessed its own architecture, no longer needs to explain. It simply breathes. The storm has passed, but not in the way he once imagined. There was no victory, no closure neatly wrapped in apology or reunion. Only awareness, standing where the noise used to be. He could see now how much of his life had been driven by fear disguised as love. Every pursuit of closeness had been an unconscious attempt to escape himself. Every argument an avoidance of silence. Every confession a plea for validation. Yet awareness does not accuse, it observes. The man who once dissected others now began to listen, not to words, but to patterns. He could trace the outline of projection like constellations across memory. The same pattern appeared in every relationship, every disappointment, every ache. It was never about them. It was always about him. Her silence had forced him into that recognition. It had shown him what remained when external mirrors disappeared. In its emptiness, he discovered an unfamiliar form of strength, one not built on certainty, but on surrender. This was not the strength of the hero, it was the humility of the soul. The Jungian path calls this movement individuation, the gradual integration of opposites, the reconciliation between persona and shadow, ego and unconscious, masculine and feminine. It is not a moral journey, but an energetic one. The more he allowed inner contradiction, the more whole he became. The silence that once divided now connected. You may wonder if he ever saw her again. In truth, it no longer mattered. Meeting her again in the outer world could not equal the meeting that had already occurred within. She had served her purpose, not as lover, not as lesson, but as archetype. Her silence had become his initiation into self-awareness. The anima, once projected outward, had returned to its rightful place, the soul's compass. He began to move differently through the world, not slower but more precise. His speech carried weight, not because of volume but because it emerged from stillness. The need to impress dissolved. The need to be understood softened. He found himself drawn to depth rather than drama, to presence rather than performance. He had learned that love is not found through pursuit, but through perception. Silence became his teacher. It spoke in pauses, in the way the wind held its breath before the rain, in the gaze exchanged between two people who no longer needed to prove. It revealed that awareness is not loud, it is vast. It does not demand recognition because it already contains it. When he thought of her now, it was without tension. She no longer existed as symbol or story, but as essence, an inner image that had once taken human form to awaken him. The psyche speaks in metaphors, and she had been his most eloquent one. He remembered the night when her silence first began. The confusion, the ache, the collapse. What had once felt like death now appeared as birth. That night had not destroyed him. It had stripped him of pretense, burned the false architecture of identity, and returned him to something elemental, awareness unbound by narrative. He began to see the same process everywhere, in others, in nature, in time itself. Every ending carried the same rhythm: noise, collapse. Stillness, revelation. Silence was not absence, it was integration in progress. The unconscious speaking softly, asking for recognition. He no longer feared relationships. He no longer sought them as validation or avoided them as danger. He approached them as mirrors, opportunities to see himself more clearly. When conflict arose, he no longer asked, "Who is to blame?" but "What is being revealed?" This shift changed everything. Awareness had replaced defense. The woman, wherever she was, remained part of that awareness. Not as fantasy, but as fact, a soul that had once crossed his to awaken the buried feminine within him. He no longer needed to thank her, nor to forgive her. Both would imply hierarchy. What existed now was equality, two psyches meeting at the exact point their wounds required. You too will meet this silence. It will come when you can no longer hide behind words. It will come when your defenses exhaust themselves into surrender. It will not arrive as punishment, but as invitation, the same invitation that transformed him, to meet the parts of yourself that no one else can complete. Silence is the final mirror. It reflects nothing but truth. In its depth, all projections dissolve. There is no victim, no savior, no villain, only awareness unfolding itself through experience. When you reach that stillness, you understand that love is not possession, forgiveness, or closure. Love is consciousness meeting itself without distortion. He no longer blamed her. He met the woman inside himself. She didn't need closure. She found clarity. When awareness arrived, the story no longer had power, only meaning.